Come closer to the fire. Let the world outside fall away. In this quiet room, the only sounds are the settling of old wood and the soft whisper of the turning page. The air smells of dust and dry paper, a scent that is its own form of time travel. The shadows thrown by the low flame are deep and long, and they seem to hold their breath with us. This is a safe space, a small circle of light carved out of the darkness, where we can look at things that are not meant for the bright, hurried light of day. Here we can handle fragile ideas without fear of breaking them. We are not looking at pottery shards tonight, nor at inscriptions carved in stone. Not yet. Our first artifact is smaller, and in many ways far more delicate. It is a single word carried down through millennia on tablets of baked clay. Language itself is an archive. Every word is a vessel, carrying not just a definition, but a climate, a kind of emotional weather from the time it was first spoken. Most of the time, we only notice the definition, the cargo. We rarely stop to feel the temperature of the air in the hold. The word comes from the oldest of our written languages, Sumerian. It is the word used to describe the arrival of the Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens. For centuries, the translation has been straightforward, academic and clean. It suggests a descent, an arrival, a coming down. It paints a picture of a deliberate, almost ceremonial act, a controlled landing, the confident arrival of beings who knew exactly where they were and what they were doing, laying out the foundations of civilization with the geometric precision of gods. It feels calm, ordered, majestic. But according to some sources, this translation is incomplete. It is technically correct, but emotionally vacant. These researchers argue for a different reading, a different emotional weather. They suggest the word carries with it a sense of tumbling, of falling, of arriving not with intention but with the desperate haste of a crash. Not a descent, but a casting down. A flight that ended in a panicked, ungraceful arrival. It suggests they did not land so much as they made impact. Feel the difference between those two worlds, built from a single choice of translation. The first is the story we know, powerful beings descending from the stars to benevolently create us. The second is a ghost story, a story of refugees. It speaks of a frantic escape from something terrifying, a journey across an unimaginable darkness that did not end in triumph, but in a breathless, terrified scramble onto the first solid ground they could find. If you have found your way here, to this quiet corner of the dark, you're a fellow wanderer. And if this story resonates with you, you can leave a soft footprint here, a like, a comment, to let the other wanderers know they are not alone. It is a quiet ritual, a way of saying you are present in this shared space with us. Once you allow for the possibility of this fear, once you accept that the first emotional weather of the Anunnaki on Earth might have been terror, not mastery, the entire ancient story begins to rearrange itself. A question begins to echo. If they arrived not as colonizers, but as survivors, what would be the very first thing they would do? What would their first mark upon the earth look like? It would not be a temple. It would be a barrier. It is a small thing, a single word. But once you feel its other possible temperature, that different emotional weather we spoke of, the entire story of the Anunnaki begins to rearrange itself. The accepted narrative is one of grandeur. It is cinematic. We are shown images, both ancient and modern, of beings descending from the heavens with purpose and authority. Gods arriving to establish order, to measure the land, to lay out the sacred foundations of civilization with an unhurried mathematical confidence. Their arrival is a proclamation. But if the source is correct, if the word carries the tremor of flight, then the first scene on Earth looks very different. It is not a proclamation, but a frantic search for concealment. It is not the grand laying of a cosmic foundation stone, but the desperate act of digging a foxhole. Imagine something touching down not in the bright light of a predestined noon, but in the deepest part of an uncertain night. Listening, waiting, scanning a horizon that is not an opportunity but a threat. This is, admittedly, a profound departure from the orthodox reading of history. Mainstream scholarship, with very good reason, builds its case on centuries of established translation and interpretation. It sees the rise of Mesopotamian culture as a logical terrestrial progression. And what we are considering here, this idea of a terrified arrival, it asks us to set that entire library of thought to one side just for a moment. to hold our breath and entertain a single, unsettling question. If you were a survivor, if you had crossed an unimaginable darkness with something terrible at your back, what would be the very first thing you would do upon reaching a place of potential safety? Would you build a monument to your own glory, or would you build a wall? This is the central question that changes everything that follows. It is the pivot upon which the entire history of our world might turn. Because if the answer is the latter, then we are not looking at the archaeology of confident colonizers. We are looking at the desperate architecture of refugees. A theory like this, however, a change in emotional weather, remains just an idea, a ghost in the air. To have any weight, it must have left a physical trace, a scar in the earth. It would need to be visible not just in the dictionary but in the mud and the reeds and the very first bricks laid down by these supposed gods. It would need a location, a ground zero for this fear. A word is a ghost, a whisper from a time we cannot touch. But a ghost needs a house, a place to haunt. And so our quiet investigation cannot remain here, suspended in the space between dictionary entries. A feeling, even one as powerful as ancestral fear, is not evidence. The question of whether they came in glory or in desperation demands a physical answer. It demands we leave the library of words and travel to the archive of the earth itself. The first page of that archive is a place of immense, almost unimaginable antiquity, a place where the dust remembers the first city. So, let us travel there now. Not in a physical sense, but in the way we do in this room. Let the firelight dim just a little more. Imagine the air growing warmer, heavier. It is thick with the memory of water and the scent of salt and clay. We are standing on a low mound, a tell in what is now southern Iraq. The wind moves through ghosts of reeds, a sound that has not changed in 7,000 years. This is Eridu. According to the scribes, this was the first of the 5 cities built before the Great Flood. The orthodox view is that Eridu was founded around 5,400 BCE. It was the home of Enki, the god of wisdom, and of the sweet waters that flow beneath the earth, the Abzu. For mainstream archaeology, it is a profoundly important, but ultimately understandable starting point. A sacred centre from which a civilization of grandeur would eventually radiate outwards. It is seen as a place of confident beginnings. But we are not here with those eyes tonight. We are here carrying the weight of that other word, that other feeling, the feeling of a desperate landing. If a people who had crossed the dark between worlds, hunted and harried, finally found a sanctuary, a habitable place with water and resources, this is what it would look like. A marshy, defensible delta at the edge of a gulf, a place to catch one's breath, a place to begin the work of not being found again. This is the test of our thesis. The orthodox story sees confident gods laying out a sacred plan. The refugee thesis demands something else entirely. It requires us to look at this first footprint and find not the signature of glory, but the scar of fear. We are here to look for the answer to a foundational question. When you are terrified, what do you build first? The grammar of survival is written in the sequence of construction, the choice between a sanctuary to broadcast your faith and a wall to conceal your presence. And so we are left here, in the dust of Eridu, with that grammar of survival. The question is how to read it. The orthodox view, the one you will find in most textbooks, sees these early foundations as a logical, almost ceremonial progression. A small shrine is built, it is revered, and over centuries, grander and grander temples are built upon its sacred footprint. A story of blossoming confidence, of a people putting down roots and reaching for the heavens. But if we stay here a moment longer, and we quiet the noise of received history, another pattern begins to emerge from the earth, a pattern that does not speak of confidence. Ask yourself a simple question of psychology, of strategy. When a powerful group arrives to colonize a new territory, what is their first act of construction? It is almost always a projection of power. They build a monument, a flag, a grand temple at the center of their new world to declare their dominion to the cosmos. They build from the inside out, radiating their presence. Now, what does a refugee do? What does a survivor do arriving on an unknown shore after a desperate flight? They do not build a monument. They build a fence, they establish a perimeter. They draw a line in the sand and say, everything inside this line is safe for now, and everything outside of it is not. They build from the outside in. Their first act is not a declaration of glory, but a definition of safety. This is the principle that some researchers argue is written into the lowest, oldest layers of Mesopotamian settlement, a principle we might call anxious architecture. When you examine the timeline of construction at Eridu, and later, more clearly at Uruk, a city that would grow to legendary status, you encounter this strange priority. According to this interpretation, the evidence for significant defensible perimeter walls often appears to precede the construction of the truly monumental temples and ziggurats we associate with Sumerian glory. The sanctuary comes later, the wall comes first. This is a profound reversal of what we might expect. It is a held breath in mud brick form. The architecture isn't shouting, _0_ it's whispering, "Are we safe here?" A confident god, a colonizer, lays down sacred geometry aligned with the stars. A frightened survivor digs a trench and builds a wall. The grand ziggurats, the temples that would eventually rise to pierce the sky, in this reading of the evidence, they were not the original plan. They were the constructions of a later generation, a generation that had perhaps forgotten the initial terror, or, more chillingly, a generation that was deliberately trying to pave over the memory of that fear with monuments of power. This isn't to say that mainstream archaeology universally accepts this timeline. The layers are complex, debated for over a century. But the emotional logic is what matters here. If the Anunnaki arrived as hunted refugees, their first physical act on this planet would have been to secure a defensible position. They would have scanned the horizon not for worshippers, but for hunters. They would have built Uruk not as a testament to their divinity, but as a fortress against a terror that had followed them across the unimaginable dark. The stones themselves, then, do not tell a story of gods descending to enlighten humanity. They tell the story of fugitives desperately trying to ensure that whatever was chasing them had not followed them through the gate. And so we are left here in the quiet, with this dissonance, a fracture between the story we have been told of powerful gods descending in glory and the story told by the first layers of disturbed earth. That faint signal of distress we first detected in the language, the subtle emotional weather of a word suggesting not a planned arrival, but a hasty escape, now seems to find its echo in the physical world. It is one thing to feel this in the abstract space of grammar, but it is another entirely to feel it under your feet in the placement of ancient stone and brick. The evidence from those earlier settlements, like Eridu and the deep foundations of Uruk, seems to follow this signal with unnerving precision. The priority of construction, as some researchers read it, speaks a language of its own. It is not the language of ceremony, but of urgent necessity. The establishment of a defensible boundary appears to precede the establishment of a sacred centre. This sequence, the wall before the temple, is a profound anomaly in the behaviour of confident builders. It is the architectural grammar of a people who believe they are being watched, or perhaps followed. If you filter out the noise of millennia and listen only to the logic of these first actions, the scene changes. The air is damp from the nearby marshes. The first structures are not gleaming ziggurats aligned to distant stars but rough enclosures. The figures moving along their tops are not priests charting constellations for esoteric rites. They are guards. Their gaze is fixed outward, on the horizon, listening. The silence is not one of reverence, but of watchfulness. The first great acts of this new civilization were not of creation, but of consolidation and defense, a held breath in mud brick form. When you assemble these pieces, the subtle terror encoded in a word, the defensive posture of the first cities, the logic of walls before worship, the grand portrait of divine colonizers begins to fade, and in its place a much more fragile and perhaps more unsettling image comes into focus. This is not the footprint of gods claiming a world. It is the desperate work of terrified survivors securing a perimeter. This is the foundation of the idea, the physical, tangible evidence of an anxious beginning. But a perimeter is only a solution for a threat that comes from outside, across the land. It is a simple answer to what they must have hoped was a simple danger. If the source is correct, however, the danger they fled was far from simple. A wall, no matter how high, offers no defense against a threat that watches from the heavens. It offers no sanctuary from a message whispered from the void. The first act was to secure the ground. But what happens when you realize the threat isn't limited to the ground at all? The walls of Eridu and Uruk, once they were raised, held a certain kind of quiet, a held breath in mud brick form, but a perimeter, no matter how strong, only defines the boundary between outside and inside. It does not organize the life within. Once a space is secured, a hierarchy always follows, a system of labor and command. And if we look to the clay tablets that survived the long quiet, they tell us a story about this system, a story that, on its surface, sounds very familiar. It is a story of workers and their masters. The story introduces a new class of beings, distinct from the senior Anunnaki, who had established their foothold on Earth. They are called the Igigi. In the grand, and often tragic family tree of the Mesopotamian gods, the Igigi are the younger ones, the subordinates. Some texts, attempting to place a number on this group, state there were 300 of them stationed in the heavens. Their role, as the Orthodox myth insists, was one of pure, grueling physical toil. According to the Atrahasis epic, a foundational Mesopotamian creation myth preserved on Akkadian tablets, the Anunnaki had the Igigi perform their work for them. For centuries, for millennia even, it was the Igigi who bore the load. They dug the great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. They dredged the canals that would feed the first cities. And most famously, they were sent to the Abzu, that deep subterranean world of Enki, to mine its precious metals. The texts are explicit. They suffered the labour, they endured the hardship. Imagine the contrast. The Anunnaki Council, making decisions from their seats of power in the newly walled cities on the surface. And far away, or high above, or deep below, the Igigi carry out the work. The dust, the noise, the endless repetition of the task. The myth paints a picture of a society with a clear division, a ruling class and a working class. A story as old as civilization itself, simply projected onto a divine canvas. For 40 years, the tablets tell us, they bore this life, and then one day they had enough. The rebellion began with an act of defiance. The Igigi, in the darkness of their minds and the toil of their canals, set fire to their tools. They gathered together, a unified front of exhaustion and resentment, and they marched on the chief dwelling of the ranking Anunnaki commander, Enlil. The text describes his terror as he saw the crowd of weary, angry gods surrounding his gate. This was not a negotiation. It was a cosmic labour strike, the first in recorded history. The crisis was absolute. The work had stopped. The masters were besieged by their servants. The Anunnaki Council convened in a state of panic, and a solution was sought. The myth tells us that Enki, the clever engineer, proposed a radical idea. Let us create a lesser being, a substitute worker, to bear the load of the Igigi. And so, from clay and from the blood of a sacrificed god, the first human beings were fashioned. They were made to be the hands of the gods, to take up the pickaxe and the shovel, and to release the Igigi from their terrible burden. And so the story, as it's told, finds its neat conclusion. A cosmic problem of labour is solved by an act of creation. It is a story that explains why human life is so often filled with toil, because we were literally designed for it. It feels complete. A tidy explanation for the order of the world. But like those first hasty walls at Eridu, a story built to explain one thing might, in fact, be concealing something else entirely. But that story, the one inscribed in the Atrahasis and echoed through millennia, feels a little too simple, a little too human. It is a story of management and labour, of bosses and workers, and while it serves to explain the creation of humanity in a neat, contained narrative, it leaves a strange, dissonant echo, especially when held against the backdrop of a terrified refugee civilization. What if the story of the cosmic labour strike is an elegant misdirection, a cover story? A simplified, palatable myth, created long after the fact to paper over a far more terrifying event. Let's return to the source text for a moment. The Igigi are described as being in the heavens. Their toil is said to be great. Their rebellion is absolute. The Orthodox interpretation takes this literally, imagining them digging canals or mining ore in some celestial location. But the language of myth is often functional, not just poetic. What if their position in the heavens was not about proximity to the divine, but about tactical advantage? If you were a survivor, a refugee who had just secured a desperate foothold on a new world, what would be your second act? Right after building your walls, you would establish a watch. You would place sentinels on the highest ground you could find, and the highest ground, the ultimate high ground, is orbit. Let us reread the myth through this lens. The Igigi are not miners, they are an orbital surveillance network, a ring of silent, sleepless sentinels tasked with the single most important and soul-crushing job imaginable, watching the void. Their great toil was not the breaking of rock, but the unending, silent, paranoid scanning of the darkness from which they had fled. Their baskets were not for carrying dirt, but perhaps for gathering data. Their tools were not pickaxes, but the instruments that allowed them to peer into the deep black. Imagine the psychological weight of this task. For centuries, perhaps millennia, their entire existence was reduced to a single function: to look back along their escape route, to watch for any sign of pursuit, to stare into the abyss, waiting for the abyss to show a flicker of movement. This was not labour. It was a state of perpetual high-stakes dread. In this light, their rebellion is no longer an industrial dispute. It is a mass psychological break. They did not throw down their tools because their backs ached. They burned their instruments because they could no longer bear what those instruments were showing them. Their march on Enlil's sanctuary was not a demand for better working conditions. It was the desperate, panicked flight of watchmen abandoning their posts because they have finally seen the thing they were tasked to look for. The story was never about hardship. It was about horror. The unbearable burden they refused to carry any longer was not work. It was knowledge. A terrible world-ending discovery made while watching the silent, patient dark. The rebellion, if we can call it that, was not born of exhaustion. It was not the simple refusal of a tired body to lift one more tool. According to the source, it was a rebellion of the mind, a collective psychological break from seeing something that should not have been seen. For an untold period, the Igigi kept their vigil. Their task, as we have reimagined it, was to be the eyes in the dark, to watch the horizon of space, not for new worlds to conquer, but for the ghost of an old one. They were watching for the echo of what had destroyed their home, a planetary defense system looking backward in time, guarding against a memory. But the silence of the void is not empty. It carries whispers, not of sound, but of gravity, of light that bends when nothing is there to bend it, of cold that is colder than the absolute zero of space should allow. For generations, perhaps, these were just anomalies, instrument errors, cosmic background noise, data to be filed away. Then the pattern emerged. The anomalies were not random. They were not the chaotic signature of a natural universe. They had a rhythm, a cadence. The source describes it as the slow, patient breathing of something immense. The gravitational whispers were not echoes of a past event. They were the footfalls of something approaching. The cold spots were not absences of heat. They were shadows, cast by something that moved with intention. This is the hinge upon which the entire story turns. The Anunnaki were not suffering from a past trauma. They were being actively hunted. The entity, the force, the intelligence that had driven them from their home system, had not given up. It had followed them. Across light years, through the silent emptiness between stars, it was tracking them. The Igigi, in their lonely orbital stations, were the first to realize this. They were the watchmen on the wall who suddenly saw not the fires of a long-dead army, but the glint of a scout spyglass in the far hills. The threat was not over. In fact, it had never stopped. Their journey to Earth was not an escape. It was merely a flight, and the hunter was still on their trail. Imagine the terror of that realization. Not for yourself, but for those you were meant to protect on the fragile blue world below. The Anunnaki leadership, Enki, Enlil, they had built a refuge based on the assumption that they had succeeded, that they had found a quiet corner of the galaxy to hide. The Igigi's discovery was a message from the void that said, "There are no quiet corners. We know where you are." Their rebellion was not a demand for better working conditions. It was a cry of pure existential dread. It was the desperate, frantic refusal to continue a mission that had become a death sentence. To keep watching was to keep seeing the slow, inevitable approach of the thing they could not fight. To remain silent was to condemn everyone. To speak was to cause a panic that would shatter their fragile new world. Their minds broke under the weight of this impossible choice. The surveillance network had become a front-row seat to their own extinction. The orthodox version of the story, both the mainstream academic and the alternative, lands on a simple transactional logic. The Igigi rebelled because of the toil. The Anunnaki needed a new workforce, and so humanity was created. A substitute, a biological machine designed to carry the load. It is a story of cosmic industrial relations, but if we stay here, in this quiet room, and hold the conclusions from the previous thought, that the Igigi were not miners, but watchers, and that their rebellion was not from exhaustion, but from a paralyzing existential terror, then the solution could not possibly be about labour. The problem was not a lack of workers. The problem was a failure of the sentinels. The eyes in the sky had gone blind, terrified of what they were forced to see. The Anunnaki were now exposed. Their orbital surveillance network, the very system designed to protect them from the cosmic hunter, had collapsed under psychological pressure. What do you do when your watchmen can no longer bear to watch? You cannot simply replace them with others of their kind. The same madness would likely take them. You need a new kind of sensor, something fundamentally different. This is where the story, according to this source, takes its most profound and sorrowful turn. The creation of humanity was not a solution to a labour shortage. It was a solution to a surveillance crisis. It was an act of desperation, an attempt to create a completely new kind of planetary shield. Imagine for a moment the cold logic that might have been presented in the Council of the Anunnaki. A planet with a few thousand technologically advanced beings hiding in bunkers is a quiet anomaly in the cosmos. It is a single, faint light in a dark room, easy to spot if you're looking for it. But a planet teeming with millions, then billions, of native biological life forms. That is no longer an anomaly. That is just another living world. The noise, the chaos, the sheer biological and psychic energy of a thriving biosphere. Could it act as a form of camouflage? A static field that masks the faint, terrified signal of the refugees hiding below. Under this interpretation, humanity was not created to dig in the earth. We were created to be the earth, to cover the planet in a blanket of life, making it appear mundane, occupied, and uninteresting to whatever was sweeping the void for signs of their ancient prey. We were not brought into existence to be their slaves, but to be their shield, a living, breathing, evolving layer of concealment. And there is a second, even deeper layer to this desperate strategy. What if the very consciousness of this new species was the instrument? The Anunnaki's own highly advanced minds had proven vulnerable to the psychological horror of watching the dark. But what if a nascent, primitive consciousness, multiplied by billions, could serve as a passive detection grid? A network of minds not advanced enough to be driven mad by the signal, but sensitive enough to register it. Think of it. The hum of 1 billion human minds dreaming, fearing, hoping. It would create a psychic resonance across the entire planet. An intruder, a cosmic hunter passing through the system would disturb this field. It would create ripples, nightmares, prophecies, sudden, inexplicable outbreaks of religious fervour or collective madness. The Anunnaki, safe in their subterranean shelters, would not need to look at the sky anymore. They could simply monitor the psychic weather of the species they had created on the surface. We would become the ultimate passive sensor array. An early warning system that did not even know it was one. This reframes the act of creation entirely. It is no longer an act of mastery. It is a gamble, a profound and ethically staggering compromise born of utter necessity. It is the story of beings so hunted, so cornered, that they would engineer another sentient race to stand between them and the darkness. And if this interpretation holds any weight, it suggests this desperate act may not have been confined to the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia alone. Other ancient stories, from other parts of the world, speak of celestial beings descending, and the strange genesis of humanity that followed. The creation of humanity in this telling was not an act of divine mastery. It was an emergency measure. A way to fill the planet's surface with a biological signal, a kind of psychic camouflage, while the true targets remained hidden below. But this solution created a new, and perhaps more terrible, vulnerability. The Anunnaki were now blind. Hiding in the deep places of the earth, in the engineered safety of the Abzu, they had relinquished the sky. They were reliant on their orbital network, their Igigi, to be their eyes. And here the story widens. It has to. A threat of this magnitude, a cosmic hunter that could frighten beings of such power, would not limit its presence to the skies above Mesopotamia. a fear that vast would stain the entire world. If this narrative holds any water, we should expect to find echoes of it elsewhere. Not just local stories, but a global pattern of trauma. And we do. We find it in a text that, for many, sits on the edge of accepted scripture, a document considered profoundly important, but too strange, too revealing, to be included in many canons, the first book of Enoch. For our purposes here in this quiet room, we are not treating it as theology, we are treating it as another ancient record, another voice testifying from the deep past. The Book of Enoch speaks of a group of celestial beings known as the Watchers. Their name itself is a blueprint of their function. They were not administrators, not messengers in the typical sense. They were stationed in the heavens, 200 of them according to the text, under the leadership of one named Semjaza, and their sworn duty was to watch, to observe the earth and humanity from their high vantage point. The parallel is almost too precise. The Igigi, stationed in orbit, watching the void for signs of the hunter. The Watchers, stationed in the heavens, observing the world below. Two different cultures, separated by time and geography, using different names but describing the exact same celestial architecture. A surveillance grid. According to the orthodox reading of Enoch, the Watchers failed in their duty because they were overcome with lust for human women. They descended, took wives, and taught humanity forbidden arts, weaponry, cosmology, enchantments. This union gave rise to the Nephilim, the giants of old renown, who filled the earth with violence and brought about the Great Flood. But if we hold it under this different light, if we read their story through the lens of the refugee thesis, another possibility emerges. What if their sin was not lust but terror? What if the Watchers, like the Igigi, were suffering from a catastrophic psychological collapse? Imagine their posting, the endless silent vigil staring out into the same darkness that held the enemy. What if they saw the same gravitational whispers, the same unsettling anomalies that the Igigi had witnessed? Their descent to Earth, in this light, ceases to be an act of rebellion born of desire. It becomes an act of desertion born of unbearable fear. They abandoned their posts. They fled the terrifying emptiness of space and sought refuge on the one place they were meant to only observe. Their teaching of humanity, of weapons, of secrets of the heavens was not a careless gift. It was perhaps a desperate attempt to arm their proxies, to rapidly advance the new biological shield on the planet's surface, hoping it could fight a battle they no longer had the will to face. The story of the Igigi and the story of the Watchers begin to feel less like two different myths, and more like two case files describing the same system-wide failure. One account, from the Sumerian perspective, focuses on the labour dispute as the public cause. The other, from the Enochian tradition, focuses on the moral and genetic transgression. But beneath both, the same pattern holds. Celestial guardians, tasked with watching, break under pressure and descend to Earth, causing a cataclysm. It suggests that this was not a localized incident. It was a global event, a mutiny in heaven that rippled across the entire planetary defense system. And if an event of this scale happened, a sky war, a desertion, the creation of new beings, it seems unlikely it would only be recorded in the fallible medium of written text. Words can be changed, books can be burned or hidden, but an image, carved into stone, that is a more durable kind of memory, a more difficult kind of witness to erase. It is one thing to speak of stories written down on parchment or papyrus, centuries, sometimes millennia after the events they describe. A text like the Book of Enoch is a memory filtered through generations of storytellers. Words can soften. Traumatic details can be reshaped into moral parable. Memory is fluid. But what happens when we leave the library of narrative and return to the archive of objects? What happens when we find evidence that is not a story told in hindsight, but a snapshot, a single, frozen, mechanical frame? For this, we must leave the mountains of Ararat and the whispers of apocryphal texts and return to the dust of Mesopotamia. Here, in this quiet room, imagine I am placing something in the palm of your hand. It is small and surprisingly heavy for its size, perhaps an inch or two long. A perfect cylinder of stone, lapis lazuli, or hematite, or obsidian, cool against your skin. Its surface is covered in the most intricate, impossibly detailed reverse carvings. This is a Mesopotamian cylinder seal. For over 150 years we have been told with great confidence what these objects are. They are instruments of bureaucracy and identity. A merchant or a priest would roll the cylinder across a tablet of wet clay, and the negative carving would leave a positive impression, a signature, a mark of ownership, an official seal on a storeroom door. The images they contain, we're told, are religious iconography, myths of the gods, scenes of ritual, the struggle between order and chaos rendered in miniature. They are categorized as art, as history, as religion. But to see them only in this way is perhaps to fall for the most successful act of camouflage in human history. Our entire journey tonight is based on asking a single, persistent question. What if we are looking at the evidence with the wrong eyes, in the wrong emotional weather? What if this categorization, art, myth, religion, is a profound and deeply convenient mistake? Let us try on a different lens. What if these tiny carved stones are not art, but data, not mythology, but technology, not scenes from a pantheon, but schematics from a war? Imagine them not as prayers, but as reports. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of a gun camera recording, or an after-action report filed by a soldier. Tiny, stone hard drives containing tactical information rolled out onto clay for debriefing. The figures we call gods, are they wearing ceremonial robes, or are they depictions of specialized armor and environmental suits? The strange symbols that float between them, are they stars and planets, or are they designations for vessel types and energy signatures? The mythical beasts they battle, are they metaphors for chaos, or are they literal renderings of a non-terrestrial enemy? This is a disquieting thought, because it takes the object out of the safe, comfortable museum case of ancient art, and places it into the cold, stark cabinet of technical intelligence. The stories of the Watchers descending from the sky, of the Igigi's rebellion against their post, those are the narratives told around the fire, long after the fact. But these seals, these tiny, intricate objects, they feel older, more immediate. They might just be the source code for those myths. The raw intelligence reports from the front lines of a silent, terrifying war for planetary survival. We have been taught to look at them as art historians. Tonight, let's try looking at them as intelligence analysts. Let us take just one of these stone cylinders, and in our minds, unroll its silent story across the clay and see what forgotten battle it reveals. Let us return to the object, to this small cylinder of lapis lazuli, cool and heavy in the palm. If you were to roll it out now, across a bed of soft clay, the image that appears is a familiar one to scholars of the ancient Near East. A scene of divine order. We see a central figure, often identified as a god like Shamash or Asher, seated within a winged disk. Rays of light emanate from the emblem. Below, other figures, part human, part animal, are locked in what appears to be ritual combat or mythological struggle. The official interpretation is clear. This is a symbolic representation of cosmic power, of the victory of order over chaos, rendered in the visual language of the 3rd millennium before Christ. It is a prayer in stone, an emblem of a worldview. But now, let us allow ourselves to change the light in this room. Let's look again, not with the eyes of an art historian, but with the cold, practical gaze of a military strategist or an engineer. Let's assume, just for a moment, that the artist was not carving a metaphor but documenting a memory. What do we see now? The wing disc is no longer a symbol. It is a vehicle, a craft, designed for atmospheric flight. The wings are not feathers, but control surfaces, stabilizers, or perhaps even a form of energy shielding. The figure inside is not a god in a state of divine grace, but a pilot in a cockpit. The rays of light are not metaphors for life-giving sunshine. They are discharges, directed energy, weapon fire. Look closer at the figures below. The hero wrestling the lion-headed eagle. Is it a hero? Or is it a figure in a protective suit, a form of biomechanical armor engaging an enemy combatant? That eagle, the Anzu bird of myth, is it a creature of legend or another kind of craft? A biological drone or an opposing fighter with a different design philosophy? The intricate patterns that fill the empty space are not merely decorative. They are the chaotic vectors of a dogfight. Tracers, energy signatures, debris. When you look at the seals this way, one after another, a terrifying pattern emerges. They are not prayers, they are after-action reports, tiny frozen frames from a long and brutal conflict, a great sky war. This is the next layer of the story. The fear that drove them to build walls and dig into the earth was not just a memory of a distant pursuit. The pursuit continued here. Earth's skies became a new theatre of operations. The Watchers, the Igigi, were not just a passive surveillance network, they were a picket line, a forward defense system. Their rebellion, their psychological break, begins to look less like a labor dispute and more like the combat fatigue of a frontline unit that has been engaged with an enemy for far too long. Some researchers argue that the ancient carvers simply lacked the vocabulary to depict what they were seeing. How do you draw a plasma discharge when the only quote, _3 _ you know is lightning? How do you carve the fuselage of a hypersonic craft when the fastest thing in your world is a horse? You fall back on the sacred and the familiar. You give the craft the wings of an eagle, the most powerful thing you know that flies. You give its pilot the face of a god. Because the power they wield is indistinguishable from divinity. The myth was not a story to explain the technology. The myth became the only technology they had to record the event. The tragedy is that the recording was so successful, so beautifully integrated into their cosmology, that we forgot it was a record at all. We began to worship the technical manual, and in doing so, we failed to see the warning it contained. That the war in the heavens was not a distant, sterile affair. It had consequences. It produced things that fell to the earth. The combat fatigue of the orbital watchers, the combat reports etched into those tiny cylinder seals. They paint a picture of a war that was not distant. It was immediate, personal, and fought in the thin air above the Mesopotamian plains. But a war in the sky never stays in the sky. Its consequences always find their way to the ground. Debris falls, power is lost, and sometimes new soldiers are made. This is where we must return to the Book of Enoch and to the most unsettling consequence of the Watcher's descent. The text is very clear on what happened next. When the Watchers, led by Semjaza, came down and took human wives, their children were not human. They were the Nephilim. In the common telling, they are giants. Monstrous beings of immense appetite and strength who consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, they turned upon men and devoured them. It's a story of divine transgression, of monstrous progeny, and of a world spiralling into chaos. But if we hold to our thread, if the Watchers were not driven by lust, but by the terror of what they had seen in the void, then their actions on the ground changed their meaning. Their sin was not desire, it was a desperate tactical decision. And their children, the Nephilim, were not an accidental byproduct of that sin. In this reading, they were the entire point. They were a project. What if the creation of the Nephilim was an act of applied science, a desperate program of bioengineering? If you are a refugee species, vastly outnumbered and technologically superior but fighting a defensive war, you do not commit your own precious few to ground combat if you can avoid it. You create a proxy force, you arm the locals, and if the locals are not strong enough, you make them stronger. Imagine the logic of it. A hurried, panicked attempt to create a ground infantry, a biological warrior engineered by combining the advanced genetics of the Watchers with the terrestrial hardiness of early humanity. The goal would have been to create a soldier that could withstand the strange energies of this cosmic war, something that could fight whatever the cosmic hunter might deploy on the surface. They needed giants, they needed shock troops, and so, according to this interpretation, they made them. The tragedy, then, is not one of divine sin, but of flawed engineering. The Nephilim were a weapon that worked too well, and then not at all. The text described them as having insatiable hunger. Perhaps the metabolic cost of their rapid growth and immense size was miscalculated. They were a biological weapon system with a critical flaw, a runaway engine that consumed its own fuel source and then turned on its creators. The violence and chaos they unleashed were not a sign of pure evil, but of a failed experiment. They were the tragic, monstrous casualties of a war they were never meant to understand, only to fight. This reinterpretation deepens the sense of desperation that clings to the Anunnaki story. This is not the act of a confident colonizing empire. This is the last desperate gamble of a people with their backs against the wall. creating a hybrid warrior race is a sign of profound fear. It tells you that the Anunnaki leadership believed they were losing and were willing to risk creating monsters to hold the line. So now, let us take inventory of this ancient battle space. The ground is a perimeter of anxious architecture. The high orbit is a watchpost where the sentinels have broken from the psychological strain. The sky itself is a theatre of war recorded on cylinder seals, and the surface is now contaminated with a failed biological weapons program. Every domain is compromised. The ground is not safe. The sky is not safe. There is only one direction of retreat left: down. And so, the picture begins to resolve. The pieces drawn from different archives of human memory start to align. The long silent watch of the Igigi from their orbital stations, a vigil that ended not in boredom but in a terror so profound it broke their discipline. The desperate pact of the Watchers, descending from their post on Mount Hermon, driven by a fear that outweighed their duty, a fear that led them to create a proxy force on the ground, a tragic failed experiment in bioengineered defense. And then there are the objects themselves, the small, dense cylinders of stone. We are asked to see them as devotional art, as mythic portrayals. But if we hold them here, in this quiet light, and trace their lines with the logic of a strategist, another story emerges. They cease to be hymns and become technical briefings. The strange celestial boats are no longer symbols, but vehicles. The radiant figures are not gods in the abstract, but combatants in advanced armor. The Great Sky War stops being a metaphor and becomes a historical event. When you assemble these accounts, the Akkadian epic, the forbidden Hebrew text, the silent stone reports, they cease to be competing interests. They become corroborating testimony from different witnesses, describing the same fundamental reality. The sky was not empty. It was not safe. It was, for a very long time, a contested battle space. A ceiling of fire and conflict, watched with anxiety from the fragile settlements below. This presents a stark tactical problem. If the initial refugee thesis is correct, then their first instinct was to secure a perimeter on the ground, the anxious architecture of Eridu and Uruk. But a wall, no matter how high, offers no protection from a threat that descends from above. The very heavens, the traditional symbol of divinity and aspiration, become a source of profound vulnerability. The geometry of survival becomes brutally simple. When the ground beneath your feet is a foothold, not a home, and the sky above you is no longer a heaven, but a hostile territory, there is only one direction left for a civilization to move, one axis of retreat that remains viable, not up. They had already fled the stars, not out, across the surface of a world they did not know and could not fully defend. No. The only logical path was down. And so, according to this rereading of the past, the great project of the Anunnaki began to shift. Their engineering, their focus, their hope for safety, all of it turned from the horizontal plane of the horizon to the vertical axis of descent, into the earth itself, seeking a shelter so absolute, so final, that even a war in heaven could not reach them. The vertical axis becomes the only axis of meaning. When the sky is no longer a cathedral of stars but a shooting gallery, and the horizon is no longer a promise but a kill line, the strategic mind has no choice. It must turn inward. It must turn downward. The final logic of the hunted is to erase their own shadow from the face of the earth, to go where shadows cannot be cast. And so, the frantic energy of the sky war begins to recede. The clamour of what some sources describe as beams of light and terrible storms gives way to a different kind of sound, a profound and encroaching silence. Imagine a descent not just in space, but in state, a journey from the high, thin air of atmospheric combat, filled with the sharp smell of ozone and burnt metal, downward, through the crust of the earth, down past the roots of reeds and the deep burrows of animals, down into a region of damp clay, then wet stone, then a darkness so complete it feels like a substance. The air grows heavy, cool, and still. The frantic pulse of survival slows to the patient rhythm of geology. The Sumerians had a word for this place, a name for this destination at the bottom of the world. They called it the Abzu. In the orthodox reading of the myths, the Abzu is the primordial source. It is the vast subterranean freshwater ocean that exists beneath the earth, the wellspring from which all rivers, lakes and springs draw their life, draw their... It is a cosmological concept, the deep that existed before creation, a realm of pure potential. It is the divine domain of the god Enki, known to the Akkadians as Ea. Enki, the clever one, the master of crafts, the god of wisdom and magic, who resides not in a celestial palace like his brother Enlil, but in these quiet, watery depths. The hymns describe it as a place of awesome and fearsome power, but not a place of war. It is a place of secrets, of creation. It is Enki's great temple, a sanctuary of stillness where he forms the designs for civilization and holds the essential principles of the universe, the me. The Abzu is, in our traditional understanding, a profoundly spiritual and poetic idea. The womb of the world, the antithesis of the chaotic, violent sky. It is the ultimate source and the ultimate retreat. A place where thought itself can take form, undisturbed by the clamour of the surface world. But in the world we have been exploring tonight, a world governed by the grammar of survival, by anxious architecture, by a desperate war against an unseen cosmic hunter, does a purely poetic space make sense? If you are a refugee, a survivor of a cataclysm that chased you across the void, do you build your final sanctuary out of metaphor, or do you build it out of rock and technology? The question hangs in the cold, still air of this deep place. We are told the Abzu is a myth, a beautiful and complex symbol for the subconscious, for the waters of life. But what if, like the cylinder seals misfiled as religious art, the Abzu has also been misunderstood? What if the hymns that describe this impossible place are not poetry? What if they are something else entirely? A set of technical specifications for a machine built to ensure survival, hidden in the one place a hunter in the sky would never think to look. Deep, in the absolute and crushing quiet of the earth itself. We are now deep within the earth, not in a metaphorical sense, but in the logic of our story. We have followed a trail of fear from a single word, to a hurried wall of mud brick, across a sky filled with a terrible silent war. And the survivors of that war, the architects of our own civilization, made a choice, a vertical choice, downward. They chose the Abzu. And here, in the quiet of this room, we must pause, because the Abzu, as it is taught, is one of the most beautiful and potent concepts in all of mythology. It is the sweet-water abyss, the primordial sea of fresh water that exists beneath the earth, from which all life, all wisdom, all creation springs. It is the domain of Enki, the craftsman, the thinker, the friend to humanity. It is a place of deep, cool, spiritual refreshment, a womb of sacred potential. The hymns describe it in breathtaking language, a house of darkness, its foundations in the silt of the riverbed, a place whose secrets no one can know. This is the poetic truth, and it is a powerful one, but tonight we are following a different kind of truth, a colder one. We are on the trail of terrified survivors, not serene philosophers, and so we must ask a difficult question. What if the poetry is camouflage? What if the beauty of the myth is the final, most elegant layer of concealment for something far more practical? Let us try an experiment. For the next few moments, let us read the hymns not as poets, but as engineers. Let us listen to the descriptions of the Abzu not as a congregation seeking spiritual meaning, but as a team of analysts examining the specifications of an unknown structure. The source texts state that the Abzu is a place of dreadful awe, a place of profound silence. This is often taken to mean a spiritual reverence, the silence of a deep cave or a cathedral. But what if it is a literal technical description? What is another place defined by dreadful awe and profound engineered silence? A bunker, deep underground. A submarine, moving through the crushing dark. A place designed specifically for acoustic dampening, to hide its occupants from whatever might be listening above. The hymns speak of its pure waters and intricate chambers. Again, the spiritual interpretation is one of baptismal purity, of divine architecture. But an engineer hears something else. They hear the language of a closed-loop life support system. Pure waters could describe a sophisticated filtration and recycling plant. Intricate chambers might not be throne rooms and chapels, but humming server farms, hydroponic bays and living quarters, all nested deep within a protective shell. One description from the temple hymns of Enheduanna is particularly striking. It describes the Abzu as the shrine, whose pure songs have been distorted. A spiritual lament, certainly. But what if pure songs refers to something like data transmissions, frequencies, a signal that has become corrupted over time? Suddenly, the language of the myth begins to shimmer, to reveal a second layer just beneath its surface. The poetry does not disappear, but it becomes a vessel, a beautiful clay vessel carrying a blueprint. The sacred descriptions of Enki's domain could be read, with only a slight shift in perspective, as a high-level technical manual for a subterranean survival installation. A place not just for dreaming, but for hiding. A place whose primary function was not creation, but concealment. So we hold the hymns in our mind's eye, not as prayer, not as myth, but as a blueprint left behind by an architect of deep time. The moment we make that shift, the poetry doesn't break. It reassembles itself into something far more functional, and perhaps far more terrifying. The Abzu ceases to be a metaphor for the subconscious. It becomes a set of engineering specifications for a planetary-scale survival bunker. Let's begin with the first problem any hunted creature must solve: sound. How do you hide from something that might be listening? The hymns speak of the Abzu's profound stillness, its unfathomable silence. In the language of myth, this is spiritual awe. In the language of engineering, this is acoustic dampening. Imagine a facility buried deep beneath the rock and soil of ancient Mesopotamia. But the hymns insist on one more layer: the vast, immeasurable body of water. Water is a notoriously effective medium for deadening vibration and sound. Any noise from the surface, the impact of a weapon, the tremors of a cataclysm, the very sound of the sky falling, would be baffled and absorbed by the immense liquid shield above the core habitat. The silence of the Abzu wasn't just peaceful, it was a tactical necessity, a held breath, engineered to last for millennia. Then there is the water itself. Why is it always described as a freshwater ocean, the Abzu? The orthodox view is symbolic. Fresh water gives life. But if we read it as a technical document, the water serves a second, even more critical purpose. One of the most efficient and heaviest materials for blocking harmful cosmic radiation is water. A thick enough layer of H2O provides a near-perfect shield against solar protons, gamma rays, and other exotic particles that would saturate any near-surface bunker. The Anunnaki weren't just hiding from a physical hunter who could see or hear them. They were hiding from a universe that had become hostile. They needed protection from the fundamental forces of the cosmos, from the very starlight itself. The freshwater ocean was not a river of the gods. It was a radiation shield, a deliberate choice by a species that understood cosmic physics intimately and had every reason to fear it. Finally, we look at the descriptions of the interior. The hymns describe the Abzu as a place of sweet-flowing waters and life-giving streams that Enki directs. In myth, this is his divine authority over nature. In engineering, this is a closed-loop life support system. These are not chaotic natural rivers, they are controlled conduits. The descriptions of sparkling, pure, ever-flowing water read less like poetry and more like a specification for an advanced filtration and oxygenation plant. The Abzu is self-contained. It processes its own waste, purifies its own water, and circulates its own atmosphere. The heart of the Abzu, where Enki's throne is said to be, could be reread as the central power and processing core for this entire subterranean world. It is a machine for living, designed to operate in complete isolation from the world above. When you put these pieces together, the acoustic insulation, the radiation shielding, the life support circuitry, the image is no longer of a mythical underworld. It is a stunningly complete picture of a hardened deep domain bunker, a place of last resort. Every poetic flourish, every beautiful metaphor that has baffled scholars for a century, suddenly clicks into place as a functional requirement. The beauty was the camouflage, the engineering was the truth, and this truth carries with it a profound melancholy. One does not build a fortress of this scale, with this level of technological desperation, unless one is haunted by a fear that is almost absolute. But a structure, no matter how advanced, is not just its engineering specifications, it has an internal weather, a psychological climate. Once the doors are sealed and the layers of earth and water close over you like a final blanket, the mind enters a new state of being. Imagine the air inside the Abzu, It is always the perfect temperature, always the same humidity. It carries the faint, sterile scent of filtration systems and the almost imperceptible tang of ozone from the machinery. There is no wind, no sudden chill, no scent of rain on dry earth, or wood smoke, or the salt of a distant sea. Every breath is a perfect engineered copy of the one before it. For a day, this is a miracle. For a year, a comfort. For a century, it becomes a form of sensory deprivation. This is the deep paradox of the bunker, a state of absolute physical safety that creates a unique and profound psychological pressure. It is claustrophobic safety. You are protected from everything that can harm you. But you are also severed from everything that makes you feel alive. The chaos, the change, the unpredictable pulse of a living world, all of it is gone. Replaced by a constant low resonant hum, the sound of the machinery that keeps you alive, the sound of your own tomb. And in the heart of this humming engineered stillness resides its master, Enki. In the orthodox myths, he is the god of wisdom, magic, and creation. But if we stand here, in the recycled air of his subterranean home, his character acquires a different light, a deep, resonant melancholy. His wisdom is not the abstract wisdom of a god, but the hard-won, introspective knowledge of a being with nothing but time and schematics to contemplate. He is the eternal watchkeeper in the quiet deep. The hymns say he would walk the corridors of the Abzu, his footsteps echoing in the metallic silence. What does a mind do in such a place for thousands of years? It turns inward, it replays every memory, it runs every possible simulation. It begins to see the universe not as a place of adventure, but as a vast, interconnected machine of cause and effect, a machine that can break. His famous empathy for the fledgling human race, in this light, looks less like divine compassion, and more like the desperate loneliness of a prisoner who can see the sunlight on the faces of those in the yard but can never feel it himself. He is the keeper of the me, the principles of civilization. But he is also a guardian of a terrible secret, trapped by the very technology that saves him. The water that shields him from the cosmic hunter above also isolates him from the world he helped to shape. His story is not one of godly command, but perhaps of a profound generational burden, the burden of knowing the sky is hostile, and that the only sanctuary is this perfect, silent, suffocating machine deep beneath the Mesopotamian earth. The quiet hum of the Abzu, that deep earth safety, feels singular. It feels like a story bound to one place, one people, one moment of cosmic terror. But what if it isn't? What if we were to pull back from the dust of Eridu, to ascend from that one specific installation, and simply listen to the Earth itself? The planet is covered in echoes of this idea, the memory of going down into the dark to be safe. Once you begin to look for it, the pattern becomes overwhelming. This descent into a protected space is not a Mesopotamian anomaly. It is one of the most persistent and foundational myths of humankind. It is a story we tell ourselves in every language, on every continent. We have given these places countless names and dressed them in the clothes of religion and spirituality. But the architecture of the story remains eerily consistent. Consider the Greek concept of Hades. We are taught to see it as a spiritual realm of judgment, but strip away the theology for a moment and look at it as a physical description. It is a place you enter by crossing a guarded boundary. The river Styx. A ferryman, a gatekeeper, must grant passage. Its primary guardian, the hound Cerberus, ensures nothing gets in that is not meant to, and nothing gets out. Inside, it is a vast, self-contained world of quiet, unchanging plains, like the fields of Asphodel. It is not a place of fire and torment. That is a later invention. The original older Hades is a place of shadow, silence, and permanence. It is a closed system. It sounds less like a hell and more like a shelter under lockdown. Travel across the world to the stories of the Maya. They spoke of Xibalba, the place of fear. Again, it is an underworld one enters through a specific geographic location, a cave, and its interior is not a simple void, but a series of highly structured environments. The texts describe test chambers, the House of Cold, the House of Knives, the House of Jaguars. In a myth, these are spiritual trials, but in a technical schematic read through the lens of a refugee, they sound like automated defences, environmental controls, or even sections of a decaying bunker where containment has failed. It is a place of immense, non-human danger, a machine you must navigate carefully. Even in the high mountains of Tibet the whispers persist. Legends of Agartha, a subterranean kingdom inhabited by an advanced race who retreated from a catastrophe on the surface world ages ago. Unlike Hades or Xibalba, Agartha is not remembered as a place of dread, but as a repository of immense wisdom and power, a civilization that continued to develop in isolation. It is the story of a bunker that succeeded, a population that survived the long wait, their technology intact, their memory of the surface world preserved. These are not isolated dreams. From the Norse Hell, a place of cold and mist, to the Egyptian Duat, a complex underworld that the sun god Re must traverse every night in his bark, the pattern repeats. A world beneath the world, guarded, contained, separate. The sheer ubiquity of these stories forces a question. Is it more likely that every early culture on Earth, independently, hallucinated the same complex spiritual geography? Or is it more likely that they were all trying to describe a real, physical memory passed down through the generations? A memory of a time when the only way to survive was to go down. The memory of a global network of shelters, a planet-wide survival strategy, of which the Abzu was only one node. It is a staggering thought, that our deepest myths are not about the soul's journey after death, but about the body's survival during a war we have long since forgotten. And so, we see the pattern repeat. Not just in the Mesopotamian basin, but across the earth. The Abzu in Eridu, Xibalba in the Mayan lands, Hades beneath the Greek soil, a network of quiet, deep places designed for one purpose, to wait out a storm, to hide from something that owned the sky. Within these subterranean worlds, there was a profound and absolute safety, a physical security that was, according to the hymns that describe it, perfect. The pressure of the earth and the ocean above formed a shield no weapon could breach. The silence was total, the darkness complete. For a people fleeing a relentless hunter, this must have felt like the first true peace they had known in generations. But perfect security, especially of this kind, has a cost. A price that is not paid in gold or labour, but in information. The very qualities that made the Abzu the ultimate shelter also made it the perfect prison. The stone and water that shielded its inhabitants from harm also shielded them from knowledge. They were safe, but they were blind. They were protected, but they were deaf. Every whisper from the cosmos, every shadow passing across the sun, every gravitational ripple from a distant approaching body, all of it was stopped at the threshold. The perfect bunker creates a perfect void of intelligence. This is the fundamental paradox of hiding. The longer you remain concealed, the less you know about the conditions outside your shelter. The quiet that was once a comfort slowly transforms into a source of profound anxiety. Is the silence outside a sign of peace, or is it the patient silence of an ambush? Has the cosmic hunter passed by, or is it simply listening, waiting for the first sign of life to emerge from the ground? Down in the deep, with the hum of the life support and the gentle flow of the engineered rivers, the greatest threat is no longer the enemy. It is the not knowing. This was not merely a question of morale or psychology. It was a critical strategic failure in their long war for survival. Hiding is a temporary tactic, not a permanent solution. The goal of a refugee is to endure until it is safe to rebuild. But how could they ever know when it was safe? To emerge from the Abzu without knowledge of the sky was to risk immediate annihilation. Their first warning system, the orbital network of the Igigi, had failed spectacularly. Their second, the proxy army of the Nephilim, had become a disaster of its own. Their grand strategy of retreating into the earth had solved the problem of immediate safety, but it had created an even more difficult one, the observer problem. They needed to see what was happening in the heavens without ever showing themselves. They needed an eye that could stare into the abyss from a place of total concealment. The problem then becomes one of profound and paralyzing contradiction. The perfect hiding place, the Abzu, the engineered sanctuary deep beneath the earth, offers absolute concealment. But the price of that safety is absolute blindness. To be buried is to be safe. To be buried is to be ignorant of the world above. This is the paradox of the hunted. You cannot watch the horizon for the approaching hunter if you are sealed in a vault beneath it. So how do you solve the observer problem? How do you watch without being seen? The answer, if we follow the logic of this hidden history, is already a vast and familiar part of the human story. We just call it by a different name. We call it religion, we call it astrology. We call it the obsessive, meticulous, multi-millennial project of mapping the heavens. Mainstream history has a comfortable narrative for this. It tells us that ancient cultures looked to the skies to understand their place in the cosmos, to predict the seasons for agriculture, to seek divine omens in the wanderings of the planets. They charted the constellations to tell stories, to build a calendar, to guide their ships. This is all true, of course. But it may only be the surface layer, the polite and useful application of a technology whose original purpose was far more urgent and far more terrifying. Let us peel back that layer. Let us imagine that the primary function of ancient astronomy was not divination, but threat detection. Imagine that it was not an attempt to understand the will of the gods, but a desperate effort to track the movement of the enemy. It becomes a long-range, passive sensor network, the largest and most patient surveillance system ever conceived. In this reading, the sky is no longer a source of wonder and spiritual guidance. It is a hunting ground. Every star is a potential hiding place. The slow, predictable dance of the planets is not a celestial harmony, but the ticking of an ancient clock, counting down to a recurring danger. The zodiac is not a set of archetypes for human personality. It is a series of sectors to be monitored, a firing solution calculated across millennia. And this system solves the observer problem with chilling efficiency. The Anunnaki themselves do not need to be exposed on the surface. They can remain in the acoustic dampened safety of the Abzu. Instead, they create a proxy force of observers. They train a caste of humans, priest astronomers, to perform the work. These human operators do not need to understand the true purpose of their observations. They can be told it is for the glory of the gods, for the stability of the kingdom, for the prediction of floods and famines. They can be given a complex system of religious meaning, astrology, that serves as a perfect cover story for a program of military surveillance. The ziggurats that climb toward the Mesopotamian sky change their character entirely in this light. They are not merely artificial mountains for priests to get closer to the divine. They are observation towers, sensor platforms. Their height is not a monument to piety, but a pragmatic requirement for an unobstructed view of the horizon. Each one is a node in a planetary network, feeding meticulous observational data, the rising of Venus, the retrograde of Mars, the slow precession of the equinoxes, into the central command below. The true meaning of the data is processed in the Abzu, while the human operators on the surface continue their sacred, unknowing vigil. It is the ultimate compartmentalization of knowledge, born from the ultimate fear. The system is elegant, it is patient, and it is global. Because if this reading is correct, then the impulse to build these celestial observatories would not be limited to Sumer. It would be a planetary imperative, a standardized technology package deployed wherever the refugees established a foothold. Suddenly, the strange similarities between megalithic structures across the world, from stone circles in Europe to temple complexes in the Americas, start to feel less like coincidence and more like a coherent architectural grammar. They are all speaking the same language of celestial surveillance. They are all looking for something, listening for something. They are watching the void. But what precisely were they watching for? The Global Observatory Network, that silent web of stone and human focus, was not searching for an army. It was not listening for a broadcast signal from a vengeful civilization. The nature of the cosmic hunter they had fled was, according to this reinterpretation, something both simpler and infinitely more terrifying. We have used the word hunter, and it carries with it an emotional weather of intention, of malice, of a will to pursue. But what if the true horror was the opposite? What if the threat had no will at all? What if it was not an entity, but a mechanism, a piece of cosmic clockwork utterly indifferent, entirely predictable, and absolutely unstoppable? The priest astronomers standing on the highest tiers of their ziggurats were not looking for ships in the darkness between the stars. They were tracking a ghost in the gravitational sense, a vast, dark, celestial body on an orbit so eccentric, so elongated, that it spends thousands of years in the frozen outer darkness of the solar system, only to swing back through the planetary plane for a brief catastrophic passage. Different sources give it different names: the Destroyer, the Great Intruder. Some link it to the later, more mythologized concept of Nibiru. But for our purpose, let us set aside those loaded names and see it for what the theory suggests it is: a rogue planet, or more likely, a failed or dying star, a brown dwarf with a family of its own smaller moons. A miniature dark solar system, a gravitational predator returning on a precise and unforgiving schedule. Its orbit, some calculations suggest, was 3,600 years long, a single, terrible year of this dark star. For most of that time, it is invisible, a whisper in the math, a slight pull on the orbits of the outermost planets. But as it reaches its perihelion, its closest approach to our Sun, it is no longer a whisper, it is a scream. It does not need to collide with anything to be a cataclysm. Its immense gravitational field is the weapon. As it plunges through the system, it is like a bowling ball thrown across a table of marbles. It destabilizes orbits. It pulls asteroids from their belt and sends them hurtling inwards. It triggers immense solar flares. It tugs on the very crust of the planets it passes, awakening volcanoes, shifting tectonic plates, and, most critically, exerting a terrible tidal force on their oceans. This was the Hunter. Not a living thing, but a recurring physical law, a cycle of destruction embedded in the very architecture of the solar system. The Anunnaki were not fleeing a war they had lost, but a home that had been repeatedly, predictably shattered by this cosmic intruder. They had found refuge here, on Earth, but it was a temporary refuge. They had arrived in a quiet season, an autumn of the long cosmic year, knowing that winter was inevitably coming back. Their entire project on Earth, the anxious architecture, the deep bunkers, the skywatching network, was a desperate attempt to survive the next passage, to weather a storm that had already destroyed their world once and would surely try to destroy this new one. And this recurring, gravitationally induced catastrophe has a name in almost every human culture on the planet. And so, this cosmic clockwork, this vast and patient engine of recurrence, brings with it consequences. The approach of the destroyer star is not a silent passage. It does not simply appear in the sky as a baleful omen for astrologers to debate. Its primary weapon, the one that requires no crew and fires no projectile, is its own immense presence, its gravity. With this understanding, one of the oldest and most universal stories in human memory begins to change its shape. It shifts its colour, the story of the Great Flood. Almost every culture, on every continent separated by oceans and millennia, preserves a memory of a time when the world was drowned. We hear it in the story of Noah and his ark. We read it in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim is warned by the god Enki to build a great boat. We find it in the Hindu tales of Manu and the Greek myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The details differ, the name of the hero, the duration of the rain, the shape of the vessel, but the core memory is identical. The waters rose, and all of civilization was washed away. The traditional telling frames this as a moral event, a punishment. Humanity had become corrupt, sinful, noisy. The gods, in their anger or frustration, decided to wipe the slate clean. It's a story of divine judgment, a hot emotional narrative of wrath and redemption. But if we hold the image of the destroyer star in our minds, if we consider its slow, gravitational approach through our solar system, another possibility emerges, a colder, quieter, and perhaps more terrifying one. The Great Flood ceases to be a story about morality. It becomes a weather report. Imagine the gravitational pull of a rogue planet or a brown dwarf passing near Earth. It wouldn't need to strike us. It would simply need to come close enough for its gravity to reach out and touch our world's oceans. The effect would be a planetary-scale tidal surge. The water of the Earth would be pulled, bulging upwards to meet the intruder, heaping itself into colossal waves that would scour the continents. The planet's crust would groan under the strain, triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, releasing subterranean waters. In this reading, the Anunnaki are not angry judges. They are astronomers with advanced knowledge of a recurring, predictable physical event. They have the orbital charts. They know the date of the next perihelion. The debates among the gods, like those between Enlil and Enki, are not about human sin. They are the panicked arguments of a command council, deciding who and what to save from a foreseeable catastrophe. Enlil's desire to let humanity perish is not divine anger, but perhaps a cold, pragmatic calculation. A cold, indifferent physics of a passing giant. We have imagined the Anunnaki Council, not as wrathful gods, but as desperate forecasters, watching their orbital models predict a disaster they could not stop, only survive. A planetary-scale event, remembered in the fragmented myths of every culture touched by the sea. Utnapishtim, Manu, Deucalion, all echoes of a single, terrible, gravitational truth. And here, for a moment, let us pause. In this quiet space, as the story unfolds, it can sometimes feel as though we are alone in our curiosity, as if we are the only ones awake at this hour sifting through these ancient fragments, trying to see the shape of something hidden just behind the veil of accepted history. But we are not. Right now, scattered across the world in other rooms under other night skies are fellow wanderers, others listening to these same words, feeling that same strange pull, that sense of a deeper, sadder story written in the margins of our world. We are a quiet community, bound not by location, but by a shared sense of wonder and a willingness to ask unsettling questions in the dark. If this story resonates with you, if you feel a sense of fellowship in this shared exploration, there is a way to make your presence known. It is not for an algorithm, but for each other. A quiet ritual to affirm that another seeker is out there. Leaving a like is not a transaction. It is a soft footprint in the dust of this digital space, a signal to other wanderers that they are not walking this path alone. And if you feel moved to, leave a comment below, perhaps with a single word that captures the feeling this story evokes in you. It becomes a kind of archive of our shared presence, a collection of quiet voices echoing from all corners of the world. It lets us know we are here, together, in this late-night library of forgotten thoughts. Consider it a small, silent acknowledgement, a nod across the firelight to the others who are also listening and also wondering. Now, let us return to the problem at hand, a problem far greater than surviving a single flood. The flood was a symptom, a side effect. The true danger, the destroyer star, was the clockwork mechanism itself. It would return. The Anunnaki knew this. Their models, their astronomical calculations, would have been brutally clear on this point. The threat was not a singular event in the past. It was a recurring appointment in the future. This introduced a challenge of an entirely different order of magnitude, a challenge not of engineering but of time itself. The silence that follows such a question is heavy. It's the quiet of a library after closing, when you can almost hear the weight of the words resting on the shelves. For those of us who have chosen to walk this path together, who have left a soft footprint in this quiet space, the scale of the problem now begins to reveal itself. We have moved beyond the immediate terror of a hunt. We have moved past the claustrophobic safety of the Abzu. We are now looking at the sky, not for a hunter, but for an appointment, a recurring, predictable appointment with catastrophe. If the Great Flood was not a singular act of divine anger, but a physical side effect of the destroyer star's passage, a gravitational tide pulling the oceans over the continents, then the most terrifying truth is not that it happened, but that it is destined to happen again. It is a feature of the cosmic clockwork they found themselves trapped within, and the clock ticks slowly. The Sumerian records, according to some interpretations, give us a number for this cycle. It is a unit of time they called a shah. One shah is 3,600 years. Let that number settle for a moment. 3,600 years. The entire Roman Empire, from its founding to its final collapse in the West, lasted for about 1,000 years, a third of a single cycle. The Great Pyramids of Giza were built about 4,500 years ago, just over 1¼ cycles in our past. The language you are hearing right now, English, would be utterly unrecognizable just 1,000 years ago. In 3,600 years, what languages will be spoken? What empires will have risen and crumbled to dust? What will remain? This is the true staggering challenge the survivors faced. It is a problem not of architecture, but of deep time. How do you leave a warning for a people who do not yet exist? How do you send a message across a chasm of time so vast that your civilization, your language, your very memory might be eroded to nothing before the recipient is even born? A message carved in stone can be weathered away by wind and rain. A text written on clay or papyrus can burn, or break, or be mistranslated until its meaning is lost. A story passed down through oral tradition will warp and change. the precise numbers and warnings softening into poetic metaphor and religious allegory. The urgent technical bulletin, quote 4, becomes a myth about gods in chariots and battles in the heavens. The Anunnaki, if this framework is to be believed, were not primitives. They were engineers. They were astronomers. They would have understood this problem with a cold, terrifying clarity. They needed a warning system that was universal, a system that could survive the death of languages, the collapse of civilizations, and the slow, grinding amnesia of planetary time. They had to build something that would last, something that would speak its warning not in words, but in the silent, unyielding language of mathematics, stone, and starlight. The problem of a message across deep time is a profound one. How do you speak to someone who will live 150 generations from now? How do you ensure your warning is not lost, not dismissed as myth, not eroded by the slow, grinding pressure of millennia? You do not write it down, not at first. Instead, you build it. You construct the message. You create a machine, made of stone and alignment, that is designed to be rediscovered and re-understood by any culture that develops even a rudimentary understanding of the sky. This is the quiet, radical thought that sits at the heart of our refugee thesis, the idea of a planetary warning network. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, which we have touched on before, were not isolated towers of worship. In this reading, they were the primary nodes in a coordinated global system. Their function was exquisitely practical. The flat plains of the Fertile Crescent were often choked with dust, the horizon blurred by heat. To track a faint, distant object, to measure its position with precision year after year, you needed to get above the interference. You needed height. The ziggurat, then, is an instrument, a viewing platform, its staircase a calibration tool, its summit an altar dedicated to a single, terrifying truth. Something is coming back. Now, allow that idea to expand. If this was the solution in the river valleys of Sumer, what would the solution look like elsewhere? What form would it take in the damp rolling hills of ancient Britain, or on the high plains of the Andes? The pattern suggests that the same fundamental design, the same urgent need, was distributed globally, adapted to local conditions and materials. This is where we must look again at the great megalithic structures of the world and wipe away the familiar patina of quote 5 or quote 6 to see the machine that may lie beneath. Stonehenge, the great circles at Avebury, the alignments at Karnak in France. For centuries they have been interpreted as temples to the sun or as calendars for agriculture. And perhaps they were used for that. A sufficiently advanced piece of technology can serve many purposes, especially after its primary function is forgotten. But what if their core purpose was far darker? What if they were not built to celebrate the sun, but to watch for the shadow that came with it? These structures are not just calendars, they are vast open-air observatories. They are instruments of immense precision, designed to lock onto specific points on the horizon, to track the rising and setting of stars over long, long cycles. They are designed to detect anomalies, a subtle wobble, a gravitational perturbation, the faintest evidence that the cosmic clockwork was once again being disturbed by the approach of the great intruder. Imagine it, a silent network, a web of stone and shadow cast across the continents. Each one, a patient eye turned to the same dark corner of the heavens. When clouds obscured the skies over one continent, clear skies on another would allow the watch to continue. It was a distributed, redundant system, the kind one would build only if the threat was so catastrophic that a single point of failure was unacceptable. The priest astronomers, the inheritors of this terrible duty, would spend their lives making these observations. They would mark the subtle shifts, generation after generation, passing the knowledge down. But this creates the final and most difficult problem. The network is working. The stone circles and ziggurats are gathering data. But where does that data go? How do you store centuries of precise astronomical measurements in a way that can survive the collapse of your civilization, the death of your language, and the forgetting of your purpose? You would need a storage medium more durable than papyrus, more universal than any single alphabet. You would need to encrypt the data, to hide it in plain sight. And so, this planetary network of stone and earth takes shape in our minds, a silent, durable system of watchers, ziggurats and henges standing patient against the erosion of centuries, their alignments holding true. They solve the first part of the problem: how to build a machine that lasts, how to create the physical hardware for a warning system that can survive the passing of ages. But here, in the quiet of this thought, we arrive at a second, far more difficult problem. A problem not of hardware, but of software. A machine is only as good as the information it holds and conveys. A stone can point to a place on the horizon, but it cannot speak. It cannot explain why we must watch that place. It cannot convey the nature of the threat, its timing, or the precise physics of its danger. It cannot pass on the memory of fear. This is the ultimate challenge of communicating across deep time. It is the data preservation problem, magnified to an almost impossible degree. Imagine for a moment that you are one of these survivors, or one of their first human apprentices. You hold the single most important piece of information in the history of your world: the orbital data of a cyclical destroyer. How do you write it down? How do you create a message that will survive not just one societal collapse, but 10, 100? Your own language, the beautiful and complex script you press into wet clay, will be dust and mystery in a few thousand years. We know this to be true. The meaning of Egyptian hieroglyphs was lost for millennia. Cuneiform became an unsolvable puzzle. Any message written in a spoken language is a bottle thrown into a storm. The bottle may survive, but the ink inside will fade, the paper will dissolve, and the words will become meaningless. Even if the language could somehow be preserved, the context would be lost. How do you describe a gravitational anomaly to a culture that has lost the language of physics? How do you communicate precise orbital periods to a people who may no longer have a concept of astronomy beyond myth and legend? The message must be so simple that a world plunged back into a dark age could understand it, yet so precise that it retains its scientific urgency. It must be immune to being turned into poetry, or worse, into a comforting religion that forgets the thing it was meant to warn against. So the true task becomes clear. They needed to find a language that does not die, a system of notation that is not tied to any one culture, any one empire, or any one level of technology. It would need to be something fundamental, something that a civilization could rediscover from first principles. Even after a global cataclysm, the message would have to be hidden in plain sight, encoded in a form that would seem like something else entirely, perhaps something nonsensical, or ceremonial, or even primitive, a format that would ensure its preservation through sheer curiosity or reverence, even long after its true purpose was forgotten. The data had to be encrypted, not against an enemy, but against time itself. The question then, lingering in the air between us, is what could such a language possibly be? And where would you hide such a message? We have spoken of the immense challenge of sending a message across the gulf of deep time, the problem of a warning that must survive the collapse of languages, the burning of libraries, the slow, grinding erosion of context, a message that must survive not only entropy, but the deliberate efforts of later generations to forget. How would you build such a thing? What material would you use? Perhaps you would choose stone, like the builders of the great megalithic network. But stone is heavy, immovable, and its message is one of geometry, not specific data. It can tell you when to look and where, but not precisely what you are looking for. No, for the data itself, for the numbers, the cycles, the precise timetables of a cosmic threat, you would need something else. Something cheap, something reproducible, something that could be copied and distributed widely, something humble. Imagine, for a moment, a scribe, sitting in the cool, dim light of a Sumerian temple archive. The air is thick with the smell of wet clay and old reeds. Before him is a tablet of damp, pliable earth. In his hand, a stylus cut from a river reed. And with painstaking precision, he begins to press wedge-shaped marks into the clay. Cuneiform. He is not writing poetry. He is not composing a hymn to the gods. He is, to all outward appearances, creating a simple ledger, a list, a piece of administrative record-keeping. This object he is creating is known to us today as the Sumerian king list. There are more than a dozen copies, fragments found scattered across the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, from Nippur to Lhasa. The most famous is perhaps the Weld Blundell Prism, a beautiful clay column now resting in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It is covered side to side, top to bottom, with these tiny meticulous marks. Its purpose seems straightforward, almost mundane. It is a list of the kings of Sumer, the cities from which they ruled, and the length of their reigns. It begins with the simple, declarative statement, quote 7. It then proceeds to list the kings who ruled from Eridu, and then the kings who ruled from Bad Tibira, and so on, a chronological record of power, passed from city to city, from ruler to ruler. It is, by all accounts, the world's first history book, and yet it is also one of the most baffling and controversial artifacts ever unearthed. Mainstream scholarship often treats it with a kind of polite dismissal. It is considered a work of political propaganda, or perhaps a later stylized attempt to impose a neat linear order on a much messier history. The reason for this dismissal is not the list of cities, or the names of the kings, it is the numbers. The numbers attached to the reigns of the earliest pre-flood kings are so vast, so impossibly long, that they shatter any conventional sense of history. They are not simply exaggerated, they seem to belong to another reality entirely. And so the list sits in its quiet museum case, a paradox in baked clay. A historical record that seems to contain no history, a ledger whose numbers do not add up, a message carefully copied and preserved for thousands of years by generations of scribes that modern scholarship has deemed, for the most part, nonsensical. But here, in this quiet room, we must ask the question that our entire journey has led to. What if the scribes were not primitive men given to wild exaggeration? What if they were the most precise and dedicated of record keepers? What if the numbers are not a mistake? What if the nonsense is simply a failure of our own context? What if we are trying to read a history book when we should be reading a data file? Let us turn back to that clay artifact, the Sumerian king list. Imagine it here with us, in the quiet. It's cool to the touch, dense with the weight of ages. As we run a finger over the columns of tiny wedge-shaped marks, we notice the document has a clear and deliberate structure. It is broken in two by a single catastrophic event. A line is drawn in the clay, and before that line are the kings who ruled before the Great Flood. After it are the kings who ruled after. It is in this first section, the antediluvian section, that the calm, orderly record of history seems to come completely unmoored from reality. The numbers listed are not just long, they are fantastically, impossibly long. They feel less like history and more like a fever dream etched in stone. The first king mentioned, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalngar, for 36,000 years. The list continues, a procession of phantoms whose time on the throne defies all biological and logical limits. Enmenluana reigned for 43,200 years, Dumuzid, the shepherd, for 36,000 years. In total, the list records just 8 kings before the flood, ruling from 5 different cities, and their combined reign, the time from when kingship first descended from heaven to the moment the flood swept over the land, is given as 241,200 years. Now, the orthodox historical view approaches this with a calm, scholarly dismissal. These numbers, it is argued, are mythological. They are symbolic, not literal. They represent a culture's attempt to create a deep, legendary past for itself, a way of saying, quote, 8. It is a form of boasting, an exaggeration meant to confer legitimacy and divine favour upon the institution of kingship. And in a world without our modern scientific understanding of time, this seems a perfectly reasonable interpretation. But a deeper anomaly lingers, a quiet insistence that something else is at play. The Sumerians were not a people given to casual imprecision. They were meticulous astronomers, obsessive record keepers, and brilliant mathematicians. If the goal was simply to boast, why these bizarrely specific numbers? Why not round figures? Why not simply write ___, quote _9 __? Why 28,800? Why is that number, and others like it, built upon? Yet the data it holds, a king who reigned for 28,800 years, forces a choice. Either the most meticulous record keepers of the ancient world were prone to the most bizarre flights of fancy, or we are reading the document wrong, fundamentally wrong. The academic consensus, for the most part, has made its choice. The antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list is myth. A metaphor for a golden age, perhaps, a form of propaganda designed to grant the institution of kingship an impossibly ancient lineage. It is a beautiful lie, a poem written in the language of administration. And so, the inquiry stops. The numbers are dismissed. The file is closed. But what if we ask a different question? What if the problem is not with the data, but with our assumption about its purpose? We assume, because it is called a king list, that its primary function is to list kings. We assume, because it uses years, that it is measuring human lifespans. What if that is the camouflage? Let the thoughts settle in the room for a moment. What if the entire format, the names of kings, the names of cities, the succession of power, is merely the carrier wave for a different signal entirely? A delivery system for a message so vital that it had to be disguised as the most mundane thing in a bureaucratic society. A ledger. This is the key that turns the lock. According to the source I am following, the Sumerian king list is not a history. It is a cryptographic package. It is a data file, engineered for transmission across deep time, and the impossibly long reigns of the antediluvian kings are not lifespans. They are not measurements of time at all. They are numbers. They are variables in a vast, intricate formula. The absurdity of a man ruling for 43,200 years was the lock, designed to repel the casual observer. But for those who knew to look not at the history but at the math, it was the key. The document in the firelight is no longer a fantastical chronicle. It is a warning machine, a silent, patient calculator built of clay and memory, preserving a set of numbers it believed were the most important in the world. The scribes who copied it may not have even known what they were preserving. They only knew it was sacred, and their duty was to copy it without error. They were the guardians of a message they themselves could no longer read. Suddenly, the madness of the numbers recedes, and in its place a breathtaking, chilling logic begins to emerge. The numbers are not the story. The numbers are the message. Let us return to that clay prism, the Sumerian king list. Let it rest here, in the half-light. We have already acknowledged the central problem, the barrier to belief that it presents. The numbers. Specifically, the reigns of the 8 antediluvian kings, which the list claims totaled 241,200 years. This is where the orthodox interpretation simply stops. It labels the object a myth, a piece of cultural boasting, and places it in a display case. But if we stay with it, in this quiet room, and honour the refugee thesis, another possibility emerges. The argument, which resides far outside the academic consensus, is that these numbers are not a failure of history, but a triumph of cryptography. The impossibly long reigns are not measures of a life lived, but variables in a complex astronomical calculation. To understand the structure of this calculation, we must first remember its foundational components. The Sumerians operated on a sexagesimal system, a base 60 model of counting. And as we have touched on before, their most critical unit of deep time was the Shah, a period of 3,600 years. According to some researchers who explore this path, this is the key. The Shah represents one full orbit of the destroyer star, one full cycle from its distant apogee to its devastating return. It is the rhythm of the cataclysm itself. Now, look again at the numbers on the prism, not as years, but as multiples of this terrifying rhythm. The first pre-flood king, Alulim, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. That figure is not random, it is precisely 8 Shah. The next king, Al-Alangar, reigned for 36,000 years, exactly 10 Shah. This mathematical precision continues down the list of the first 8 kings. Each reign is a clean whole number multiple of 3,600. This is not the pattern of exaggeration. It is the pattern of deliberate engineering, and the grand total, that breathtaking figure of 241,200 years, divides by 3,600 to produce the number 67. The entire epoch before the flood, as recorded by the scribes, is precisely 67 orbits of the object that caused it. The document transforms before our eyes. It is no longer a fantastical history. It is a celestial clock, a countdown machine built of names and numbers. Each king is not a man, but a label for a block of time. Each reign is not a life, but a gear in a vast cosmic model designed to track the approach of an ancient enemy. The scribes who so patiently copied this list for millennia were not recording their people's history. They were maintaining the integrity of a warning system. The sheer absurdity of the numbers is therefore not a bug, but a feature. A reign lasting 28,000 years is so fundamentally impossible for a biological being that it serves as a kind of password. It signals to any future, mathematically literate civilization, do not take this literally. It is an invitation to discard the historical narrative and search for the code underneath. The impossibility is the key that unlocks the file, and in this, we see the profound, desperate genius of the system. They did not write a simple warning, because languages rot. They did not carve a simple story, because stories decay into myth. They encoded the warning into the one language they believed to be universal and eternal, the cold, perfect relationships between numbers. They chose to speak in mathematics, a language that could withstand the erosion of empires and the shifting of continents, hoping that someone, someday, would be listening carefully enough to hear. The question then becomes not how they encoded the message, but why they chose this specific, incredibly arcane method. Why hide a warning inside a list of kings with impossible lifespans? Why not write it plainly? The answer, if we stay with this line of thought, is a quiet testament to their understanding of time. Not just the cycles of the heavens, but the corrosive, grinding nature of time on information itself. They were engaged in a form of cryptography against the ultimate adversary, entropy, the slow decay of all things. Imagine the council, Enki perhaps, or a committee of their most sober minds, tasked with this problem. The message must survive for thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years. It must cross the ruin of empires not yet founded. It must speak to cultures whose languages have not yet been born. It must endure translation, misinterpretation, and the simple, devastating act of being forgotten. What medium do you choose? You do not choose language. Words are alive, and because they are alive, they change and they die. A word that means warning in one millennium can mean blessing in the next. The emotional weather shifts. The grammar erodes. A direct warning, written in Sumerian cuneiform, would be a message in a bottle with no guarantee that the finder would be able to read it, or even recognize it as a message. It would become a relic, a curiosity for linguists, its urgency lost to academic debate. You do not choose imagery alone. Symbols are even more vulnerable to the drift of meaning. A skull and crossbones might mean poison to us, but to a culture 1,000 years from now, it could be a religious icon or a symbol of royalty. The Anunnaki themselves, depicted as horned gods, became objects of worship. Their technology, rendered on cylinder seals, became myth. Imagery untethered from a stable context is an invitation to storytelling, not a preserver of data. So, what is left? What language survives the death of its speakers, the burning of libraries, the collapse of civilizations? According to this source, the answer they arrived at was mathematics. The relationships between numbers are the one constant in a universe of change. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is pi, whether you're in Sumer or on a world orbiting another star. The properties of a prime number are absolute. Mathematics is the bedrock language of reality itself, and it is the only form of communication that is truly universal and eternal. A story can be twisted, a warning can be ignored, but a calculation can only be right or wrong. This is the profound genius of the king list, if we see it as a data file. By encoding the warning, the orbital periods, the countdowns, the intervals between catastrophes, into the reign lengths of kings, they were embedding the message in the only medium that could not be distorted. The numbers themselves, 28,000, 800, 36,000, 43,200, are the signal. The stories of the kings, the cities, the transfer of power, that is just the camouflage. It is the carrier wave, designed to be interesting enough for scribes to keep copying it, but not so literal that it would be suppressed or disbelieved outright. They were not writing a history, they were building a clock, a celestial clock whose gears and teeth were numbers, hidden inside a story. They trusted that any civilization advanced enough to face the threat would also be advanced enough to recognize the impossibility of the numbers and to search for the pattern hidden beneath. The absurdity was the key, the history was the lock, and the message was for anyone, anywhere, any time who learned how to count. And so, here we are, in this quiet room, looking at the shadow of an idea, the idea of a message in a bottle, engineered to survive the wreck of civilizations. a warning encoded into the one language that might withstand the erosion of millennia, the language of pure mathematics. The system, if the source is to be believed, was nearly perfect. It used the immense, unbelievable numbers of the antediluvian kings as a cryptographic shield. It relied on the profound conservatism of scribal culture, where a scribe's duty was to copy, not to interpret, ensuring the data was transmitted without corruption. The scribes who painstakingly pressed these figures into wet clay for thousands of years were the unknowing guardians of a doomsday clock they could not read. They were preserving the signal while believing they were only copying the noise of mythic history. This is the genius of the design, but it is also the source of its profound and perhaps final tragedy. Because a message that is perfectly encrypted requires two components to be read: the encrypted data itself and the decryption key. The Sumerian king list in this reading is the data, a hardened, durable package of information designed to last. It has survived. It sits in a museum, under quiet lights, its numbers clear and precise. But the key was separate. The key was the context. It was the set of instructions that said, take these numbers and apply this formula, and look to this part of the sky at this specific interval. The key was the knowledge that this was not a history, but a machine, and that knowledge was infinitely more fragile than the clay tablet it was meant to unlock. While the numbers were preserved by ritual, the key was likely preserved by understanding, and as the generations passed, as the cosmic threat faded from memory into myth, the understanding was lost. The operational manual was misplaced. The last person who knew how to read the machine died, and with them, the purpose of the numbers they so carefully preserved. This is the intellectual climax of this entire story. It is not a moment of discovery, but a moment of profound loss. We may be holding the most important message ever left for humankind, a precise timetable of a recurring cosmic danger, and we are staring at it like a tribe who has found a microchip in the sand, admiring its intricate patterns without a clue as to its function. The system worked too well. The camouflage was too effective. The Anunnaki, or whoever built this warning system, succeeded in getting the message to us. But they failed to get us the one thing we needed to understand it. The decryption key is gone, lost somewhere in the flood of time, eroded by the very entropy it was designed to defeat. We are left with the ghost of a warning, a beautiful, complex, and utterly silent piece of mathematics, masquerading as a child's tale of ancient kings who lived for impossible lifetimes. The message arrived. The warning is in our hands, and we can no longer read it. The tragedy is not that the message was lost. The tragedy is that it was found. And so, we arrive back at the object that began this final part of our journey, the clay prism, the Sumerian king list. For a moment, let us see it not as a puzzle to be solved, but simply as a thing made by human hands, a scribe, thousands of years ago pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, carefully forming the cuneiform wedges that list the names and the numbers. Here, in the quiet of this room, we are faced with a deep and profound contradiction, a canyon that runs through the heart of history. On one side of this canyon is the narrative we have followed together tonight, a story of a desperate flight from a cosmic hunter, a story of anxious architecture where walls were raised against an unseen terror before any temples were built for worship. It is a story of a traumatized orbital guard, the Igigi, pushed into rebellion not by labor, but by the psychological horror of their vigil. It is a story of a deep subterranean sanctuary, the Abzu, engineered for survival, not for spiritual journeys. And finally, it is the story of a vast planetary network of observatories, all feeding data into an encrypted time capsule disguised as a simple list of kings. This is a narrative of fear, of engineering, of survival at all costs. And on the other side of the canyon stands the story we are all familiar with, the one taught in books and depicted in art. The story of powerful, serene gods descending from the sky in glory, creators who shaped the world and humanity with unchallenged authority, divine kings who ruled with cosmic mandate, a narrative of power, of order, of confidence. The two stories cannot both be true. The emotional weather of one is a storm of anxiety, the other is the calm certainty of command. If the first story, the story of the hunted refugee, has any truth to it, then the most important question is not what happened, but but what happened next. How did the raw, terrified memory of survival become the polished, majestic myth of divinity? This process, the final and most mysterious act in the entire drama, is not a simple case of legends growing over time. It is not the gentle, passive erosion of fact by the waters of history. The evidence, if we're to follow this thread to its conclusion, points to something more deliberate. An active transformation, a kind of alchemy performed on history itself. This is the beginning of the mythologization process, the conscious act of taking a technical reality and wrapping it in the protective layers of sacred story. It is the process by which a star chart becomes a prophecy, a bunker becomes a holy underworld, an encrypted warning becomes a tale of impossibly long-lived kings, and most importantly, the process by which a group of terrified survivors become gods. The question that will guide us through the final few doors of this place is, why? Why go to such extraordinary lengths not only to survive a threat, but to so completely and utterly bury the memory that you were ever afraid at all? The process was not one of decay, but of careful, deliberate construction, a project of such immense scale and duration that it has no real parallel. Some researchers, tracing this thread of logic, call it the long burial, a decision made across generations to take the raw, terrifying technical history of their survival and entomb it, to bury it so deeply beneath layers of metaphor, poetry and religion that its original form would become unrecognizable, even to those who guarded its tomb. This was not a conspiracy to deceive. It was an act of profound, if tragic, empathy. The motive was not control, but protection. The creation of a psychological shield for their children. For us. Imagine a parent who has survived a terrible ordeal and now must raise a child in the house where it happened. Do they recount every harrowing detail of the home invasion? Do they describe the true nature of the monster that may one day return? Or do they tell a story? Do they turn the creaks of the floorboards into the footsteps of mischievous sprites and the strange locks on the doors into magical wards against fairy tale dragons? They do this not to lie, but to create a space where the child can grow without being paralyzed by a fear it cannot possibly comprehend. The long burial, according to this view, was precisely this, a multi-stage project of psychological alchemy. The first stage was abstraction. The physical realities of their survival technology were turned into elemental concepts. The subterranean Abzu, a marvel of engineering with its life support and radiation shielding, was abstracted into the mythic concept of a freshwater ocean, a source of primordial wisdom. The Igigi surveillance grid became the host of heaven, their constant watching of the void transformed into a divine, unknowable celestial duty. The second stage was personification. These abstract forces were given faces, names, and human-like emotions. The automated defense systems of the sky became the arrows of a storm god. The chief engineer of the Abzu, perhaps a melancholic figure burdened by the weight of their claustrophobic safety, became Enki, the lord of the deep. Each function of the survival machine was given a personality, a mask that hid the cold wires and humming machinery beneath. The final and most crucial stage was moralization. The purely mechanical, amoral nature of the cosmic threat was replaced with a narrative of divine justice. The Great Flood was no longer the predictable gravitational side effect of the destroyer star's passage. It became a punishment for human sinfulness. This was the masterstroke. It gave humanity a sense of agency. It suggested that catastrophe could be averted through prayer, through good behavior, through ritual. It replaced the unbearable truth of cosmic helplessness with the manageable fiction of moral responsibility. The Anunnaki, in this telling, built a beautiful, ornate cathedral of myth directly on top of the silent, grim architecture of their nuclear bunker. They did it because they knew a civilization cannot be built on a foundation of pure terror. Humanity could not thrive while staring into the same void that had broken the Igigi. A child cannot sleep peacefully if they know their parent is awake all night, every night, staring at the door, listening for a sound they hope never comes again. But there was another layer to this, a reason for the burial that was not for our sake, but for theirs. That final act of concealment, the long burial, was so complete, so patient, that it succeeded beyond any rational expectation. The technical memory faded into myth. The astronomical warning became a king's boastful fiction. the psychological shield we spoke of held. It protected humanity from a truth it was not equipped to bear. But here, in the quiet, we must ask a final question. Was that shield truly for humanity alone? Imagine a civilization that had mastered energies we can only dream of, beings who could cross the void between worlds, re-engineer biology, and build machines that lasted for millennia. Now imagine them arriving on a new world not in triumph, but in a desperate, panicked flight. Imagine them scurrying for cover, building hurried walls of mud brick, descending into the dark of the earth to hide from something that terrified them. There is a power in that story, an empathy. But for the survivors themselves, there might be something else, a profound and unbearable shame. If this rereading of the past holds any water, then the Anunnaki were not just refugees. They were defeated. They were prey. For all their knowledge, something else was stronger or faster or simply more relentless. The act of survival is noble, but the memory of being hunted is a deep wound to the pride of any creature that considers itself powerful. Could it be that the long burial had a dual purpose? That the mythologization process was not just a gift of peace to humanity, but a necessary act of self-deception for the Anunnaki themselves? Think of a king who tells the story of his coronation, but leaves out the part where he had to hide in a swamp to escape his enemies. The story he tells is not technically a lie. He was crowned, but its emotional weather is entirely different. He edits his own history to align with the dignity he feels he must project. Perhaps, on a civilizational scale, this is what happened. The Anunnaki, once safe, began the slow work of editing their own legacy. The story of their panicked descent was slowly, carefully overwritten. The hurried construction of Eridu was reimagined as a sacred act of cosmic alignment. The claustrophobic safety of the Abzu was transformed into the poetic mystery of Enki's watery domain. The frantic sky-watching for a returning terror was softened into the stately procession of the gods assigning fates and destinies. They were not just hiding the truth from us. Some sources suggest they were hiding it from their own descendants, from themselves. They chose to remember themselves as conquerors, as creators, as masters of fate who descended from the heavens in glory. Because the alternative, the memory of trembling in the dark, was simply too much to integrate into their identity. The shame was a poison they needed to bury just as deeply as the warning itself. And so this brings us to a quiet and perhaps most important point of reconciliation. What of the history we know? The grand narratives of kings and empires, of gods establishing order from chaos, meticulously catalogued by generations of dedicated scholars and archaeologists. If this story of hunted refugees and a long burial of truth holds any water, does it render all of that work incorrect? The source I have followed insists on the opposite. It is not that Orthodox history is wrong. It is that Orthodox history is a perfect and faithful reading of the intended document. It is the successful reception of the most ambitious public relations campaign ever conceived. A message so effective it has held for thousands of years. The grand cover story worked. The psychological shield held. Imagine an archaeologist in the 19th century carefully lifting a tablet from the Mesopotamian dust. They see a hymn to a powerful sky god, a creator who descends with authority and lays out the foundations of civilization with divine confidence. The translation is precise, the context is built carefully, the conclusion is logical. These people worshipped powerful celestial beings who they saw as masters of the universe. According to the refugee thesis, that archaeologist is not making a mistake. They are reading the final polished draft of history. They are experiencing the intended effect of the artifice. The shame we, here in the quiet, are trying to hear the faint mechanical hum of the hidden machinery backstage. They are not mutually exclusive. One is the performance, the other is the reality of its production. The story of gods was the medicine, and the very existence of that medicine points, ever so quietly, to the memory of a disease we were never meant to remember. And so, the journey through those immense corridors of time brings us back here, to the quiet of this room. The fire has burned a little lower now, hasn't it? The shadows it casts are longer, softer. For hours we have walked through a history that feels haunted. We have stood on the imagined banks of the Euphrates, felt the chill of the void between the stars, and descended into the engineered darkness of the Abzu. And now we return to the simple, physical fact of this space. The air is still, the world outside the window is asleep. But something has changed. It is the subtle shift that happens after a long and difficult story has been told. A story that, once heard, cannot be unheard. The purpose was never to replace one history with another, as one might replace a stone in a wall. It was to feel the weight of another possibility. To look at the familiar architecture of our world, both physical and mythological, and see the faint outlines of a much older, much more frightened structure beneath it all. To look up at the moon and wonder not about its beauty, but about who might have once watched it with a professional, desperate anxiety. To hear a story about a vengeful god and wonder if it is not a memory of a terrified commander. This is the echo of the long burial, the understanding that the grandest stories, the most inspiring myths, might not be celebrations of power, but the most elaborate and successful shields ever built. Shields to protect us from a truth so vast and so cold that it was deemed unbearable. A form of kindness, perhaps, an act of parental protection from the Anunnaki to their children, hiding the monsters that chased them across the cosmos so that we could sleep soundly. And now, in the safety of this room, surrounded by the gentle dark, we can hold that possibility without being broken by it. We can feel the immense melancholic ache of it all, and then we can let it go. And so, the story settles. The light from our imaginary fire casts long shadows, and the dust of millennia seems to finally come to rest in the quiet air of this room. We have travelled from a single word to a wall of mud brick, to the cold, silent orbit of a terrified watchman. We have descended into the engineered darkness of the Abzu, and looked up at a sky tracked by a priesthood of astronomers, all waiting for the return of a terrible appointment. We have held a clay prism in our hands and felt the weight of its impossible numbers. And now, the journey is done. The narrative thread we have followed through this labyrinth has led us back here, to the quiet. There is nothing more to prove. The purpose of this journey was never to demand belief. It was not to replace one set of historical certainties with another. You do not have to carry this story with you as a new truth. That was never the contract between us. The real purpose was to see if all the broken pieces, all the fragments that don't quite fit the official story, could be gathered together and arranged into a different shape, a shape that possessed its own kind of coherence. A story where the deep illogical sadness in our oldest myths finally had a source, where the anxious haste of the first builders made a kind of tragic sense. It was an exercise in emotional archaeology, an attempt to find a version of the past that felt complete, even if that completeness is unsettling, even if it is a story of survivors, not of masters. So now you can let it all go. Let the names of the kings and the numbers of their reigns dissolve. Let the walls of Uruk fade back into the dust. Let the watchers in the void finally close their eyes. The intellectual work is finished. The story has been told, and its weight can be set down. Allow the ideas to become like the embers in the hearth, glowing softly, without heat or demand. They are simply patterns of light in the darkness, and you can watch them fade as you drift. There are no questions to answer. There is no conclusion to draw. There is only the quiet and the gentle release of a long and winding tale coming to its peaceful, silent end. The mind has had its journey. Now it can rest. And so, our time together in this quiet place comes to an end. The last of the embers in the hearth have begun to fade, and the stories we have explored are settling back into the stillness of the archive. Fellow wanderer, thank you for keeping this watch with me. May your sleep be deep, and your dreams untroubled by the echoes of forgotten kings or the weight of ancient skies. May you find a quiet harbour in the darkness, far from the memory of any cosmic storm, and drift in perfect peace. Know that this room, and the stories held within its shadows, will remain. The fire will be kept, and a seat will be waiting for our next journey into the long dark. There is always more to find here in the quiet. Until then, sleep now.